The bells of St. Odelia's tolled a damp, heavy rhythm, a sound swallowed by the Sunday morning drizzle coating old Brooklyn. The air inside the small church was thick with the scent of old incense, beeswax, and the lemon-scented floor polish Marina Lowell was currently abusing. She worked the heavy-duty mop over the flagstones with a weary rhythm, her breath fogging in the chill. This was not the career she'd envisioned. 6 months ago, she was Marina Lowell, RN, a damn good nurse. Now, she was just Marina, the woman who cleaned the church for $50 and whatever was left in the poor box, which was usually nothing. She was sweeping near the back pews, collecting the debris of the faithful discarded bulletins, a stray cough drop, a single glove when she saw him. He was an anomaly. St. Odelia's congregation consisted of old women with rosaries wrapped around their knuckles and young families trying to impress them. This man was neither. He sat slumped in the very last pew, perfectly still. He wore a black suit that cost more than Marina's last 3 months of rent. His head was bowed as if in deep prayer, but the angle was wrong. It was too low, too heavy. A shadow moved beside her. Mrs. Agnes, the church sacristan, and a woman who seemed to be held together by prayer and starch, materialized at her elbow. The old woman's hand, gnarled with arthritis, was trembling as she pointed a single finger. "Oh, dear Lord, Mrs.," Agnes whispered, her voice like dry leaves. Marina's eyes followed the finger. A dark stain was spreading across the man's crisp white shirt, blooming from the center of his chest. It was red, a deep, arterial crimson. "Mrs." Agnes took a staggering step back, her rosary beads clicking like terrified teeth. She stared at the stain, her eyes wide, not with just fear, but with a strange, profound recognition. "God's not done with you yet, son," she breathed, a statement of fact, not comfort. Marina's training kicked in, shoving aside the fear. The man was dying, right here. She dropped the mop with a clatter that echoed in the vast, empty space. "Call 911. Mrs. Agnes," she commanded, her voice regaining its lost authority. She rushed to the pew, her mind already triaging. Check for pulse. Apply pressure. Assess the wound. She slid in beside him, her hand reaching for his neck. Sir, can you hear me?" His skin was cold, but there was a pulse, thready and fast. Her gaze dropped to the wound, and she froze. It wasn't blood. Not all of it. There was some blood. Yes, a shallow graze on his side that was soaking the shirt, but the thing misses. Agnes had pointed at the perfect, terrifying circle of red on his sternum. Wasn't a wound. It was light, a small, unwavering, impossibly bright red dot that painted his chest. Marina had seen enough action movies with her little brother to know what that was. Her stomach turned to ice. It wasn't an exit wound. It was an entry point. The realization came a half-second too late. A sound like a giant's whip crack tore the holy silence apart. It wasn't a gunshot. It was an explosion of sound that seemed to shatter the very air. The magnificent stained glass window of St. Michael, high above the altar, disintegrated into a million pieces of colored rain. "Mrs.!" Agnes screamed, a high, thin sound that was almost immediately lost. Marina didn't think. She reacted. In one violent, desperate motion, she grabbed the front of the man's expensive suit and pulled. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bespoke tailoring. But her adrenaline-fueled fear was stronger. She hauled him sideways, tumbling out of the pew and onto the freezing stone floor, just as a second shot pinged off the oak where his head had been. Plaster dust and colored glass rained down on them. The church was filled with chaos. The few other early arrivals, mostly the choir, were screaming, cowering behind the organ. Marina lay half-sprawled on top of the man, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. He was very much awake now. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his movements fluid and dangerous. He wasn't a civilian. He wasn't a victim. He was something else entirely. He looked at her, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, a flat, hard gray that held no gratitude, only a cold assessment. Then they softened. Just a fraction. He saw her face, the shock, the plaster dust in her hair. "Don't call the cops," he whispered, his voice a low gravel, laced with a faint, unplaceable accent. The words were a command, not a request. He winced, his hand going to the graze on his side. Who they're hunting?" Marina could only stare. He smelled of expensive cologne, rain, and the metallic tang of gunpowder. His face was all sharp angles and contradiction, a brutality in the line of his jaw and a strange, broken pride in his eyes. Distant sirens wailed, growing closer. The sound snapped the spell. The man moved. He was a shadow detaching itself from the floor. One moment he was beside her, his body a warm, solid presence against hers, and the next he was gone. He didn't run. He flowed, disappearing through a small sacristy door at the side of the nave, melting into the rainy Brooklyn morning as if he were just another ghost in a church full of them. Marina stayed on the floor, shaking, until the first police officer rushed in, gun drawn. She told them what she could. A man was shot at. He ran. She didn't see the shooter. She didn't see the man. It was all a blur. They saw her, a girl in jeans and an old sweatshirt, holding a mop handle like a lifeline. They believed her. It was only hours later, after the police were gone and Agnes was sipping heavily brandied tea, that Marina found it, while sweeping up the last of the glittering glass shards. Her hand brushed against something cold on the floor beneath the back pew. It was a ring, heavy, platinum, or something like it. It was too large for her finger. She held it up to the light of a surviving candle. The design was stark, minimalist, an engraving, 2 letters, E-M, intertwined with a name, Redwater. The ring felt heavy in her pocket, a cold, smooth burden against her thigh. For 2 days. Marina Lowell lived in the echo of that gunshot. She'd gone back to St. Odelia, scrubbed the floors with a frantic energy, trying to erase the memory of violence from the holy space, but she couldn't erase the ring. Redwater. It was a name that belonged on a bottle of expensive whiskey, not a piece of jewelry found on a church floor. A quick search on the library's public computer confirmed the first part. Redwater was a chain of sleek, impossibly expensive bars in Manhattan, the kind of places that had velvet ropes and guest lists. The owner, according to a fawning business article, was a recluse named Elias Moretti. There was one photo, a man in a dark suit at a charity gala, his face blurred by the camera's movement, but the caption was clear. He was a phantom of high society. This didn't sit right with Marina. The man in the pew hadn't felt like a nightclub owner. He had felt like a soldier or a ghost. Her nursing instincts, the part of her that analyzed and diagnosed, told her a piece was missing. She used a precious $20 to buy a prepaid data card and dug deeper, using her old knowledge of public record databases. And there, buried in an archived news report from 5 years ago, she found him. Special Agent Elias Moretti, FBI decorated, a specialist in deep cover infiltration of organized crime. He had been part of a major task force, and then, 5 years ago, he had simply vanished. The article hinted at a case gone wrong, an investigation that was quietly and quickly shuttered. He was presumed dead, or worse, turned. The man in the church was not a businessman. He was a dead man. And the dead man's world was now bleeding into hers. It started subtly. A persistent click on her landline, a sound she'd only ever heard in old movies. Then, a man reading the same newspaper at her bus stop 3 mornings in a row, never once turning the page. Yesterday, walking home from the grocery store, she had the distinct skin-crawling sensation of being followed. When she spun around, the street was empty, but the feeling remained, cold and sharp, like a sliver of glass under her skin. Her quiet, broke, and predictable life had been contaminated. She was boiling water for her 3rd cup of cheap tea that night, her small Brooklyn apartment feeling more like a cage than a sanctuary. When she heard it, A faint scraping sound, not at the door, but at the window, the fire escape. She froze, the kettle whistling like a scream. Before she could even grab a knife, a shadow detached itself from the window frame and solidified in her kitchen. It was him, Elias Moretti. He looked worse than he had in the church. The suit was gone, replaced by dark jeans and a worn leather jacket. There was a fresh, angry-looking stitched wound above his eyebrow, and his storm-gray eyes were hollowed by exhaustion. He'd picked the cheap lock on her window guard as if it were a polite suggestion. "You're a hard woman to find off-grid," he said. His voice was the same low gravel, filling the tiny kitchen, making it feel even smaller. Marina's heart hammered against her ribs, but her fear was quickly being burned away by a cold, sharp rage. "Get out of my apartment!" He ignored her, his eyes scanning the room, cataloging her life in seconds, the stack of overdue bills on the counter, the single-serving box of pasta, the framed photo of her and her younger brother. His gaze lingered on that, then snapped back to her. "You saved my life," he stated, as if it were an inconvenient fact. "Now you're in this game with me." "The hell I am," Marina shot back, gripping the hot kettle. She was shaking, but she wouldn't let him see it. "I'm not in any game. I'm a nurse. Or I was. Now I'm just the woman who's being followed by strange men because you decided to get shot in her church." "They're following you because they know you saw it, Malin," he said, taking a step closer. She didn't back down. "I saw you." "You saw the dot," he corrected, his voice dropping. "You're the only person who saw that sniper's laser and lived to talk about it. You're a witness." A bitter laugh escaped her. "A witness to what you ran. I lied to the cops. We're done." "We're not." He was close now. She could smell the rain on his jacket and the faint metallic scent of his blood. A strange, terrifying magnetism crackled between them. It wasn't attraction, not in the normal sense. It was the pull of two opposing forces suddenly locked in the same orbit. Fear and fascination. "The people hunting me," he said, his voice quiet, intense, "are called the Ashen Circle. They're not just gangsters. Marina, they're a corporation. They hide behind a humanitarian fund. They donate to hospitals. They build orphanages. And under all of it, they are the most ruthless organization you've ever imagined." He paused, and the next words sounded like they were torn from him. "I was an agent. I was inside for 5 years. I was closer than anyone had ever been. And then I was betrayed by the one person I trusted. He needed her. That's what this was. He was a ghost, and he needed a tether to the living world. Why me? What do you want from me?" "The dot," he repeated. "It proves the assassination was professional, not some random street violence. It's the key to linking the hit back to the circle. You're the only one who can place that sniper." Marina's mind reeled. This was insane. This was a man who belonged in the dark alleys of the world, and he was trying to drag her in with him. Her nurse's oath, her entire moral compass, screamed at her to call the police, to tell them everything. "I'll go to the FBI. I'll tell them what I saw." A harsh, mirthless sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. "The FBI, who do you think I was betrayed by?" That hit her like a physical blow. There was no one to trust, only this man, this dangerous, broken man who had brought a war to a holy place. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't. I won't. I hate guns. I hate this. I just want my life back." He studied her for a long, heavy moment. The hard lines of his face seemed to deepen, the exhaustion giving way to a raw, desperate resolve. When he spoke again, his voice was stripped of all its coldness, leaving only a terrible weight. "If I die," he said softly, "if they find me and finish the job, the Ashen Circle wins, the betrayal stands, and all the information I gathered, all the lives I lost. It's for nothing. But it's not just me." He looked past her, toward the small cross she kept on the wall. "That church. They want it. It's on a key piece of property. If I die, that building will be the grave for hundreds of innocent people. They're planning something, Marina. Something bigger than me, and you and I are the only ones who can stop it." He was offering her a choice that was no choice at all. Her quiet life was already gone. She could either run and let the shadows win, or she could step into the dark with this man and fight. Marina looked at his storm-gray eyes, seeing the desperation and the pride she remembered from the pew. She put the kettle down, her hand steady now. "Where do we go?" she asked. He didn't give her time to pack. He just grabbed her coat, shoved her wallet into its pocket, and pulled her toward the fire escape he'd come in through. "Move, now." They descended into the guts of Brooklyn, a world Marina never knew existed. Elias pried open a storm drain grate with a small steel crowbar from his jacket, revealing a rusted ladder that dropped into blackness. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where they can't follow," he said, and went down first. She followed him into a labyrinth. They moved through forgotten subway tunnels, the tracks long since dead. The only light came from the weak beam of Elias's penlight, dancing over graffiti-covered walls and the skeletal remains of old-world construction. The air was cold and wet, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water and the scuff of their shoes on the gravel. After what felt like hours, he stopped, pushing open a corroded metal door into a small, windowless chamber, a disused maintenance bunker. It was musty and smelled of oil and rust, but it was dry. He dropped his heavy duffel bag to the floor and finally, for the first time, let his posture slump. He leaned against the concrete wall, his face pale in the penlight's glare, and his hand was pressed tight against his side. The graze from the church, the one she'd barely registered, had opened up. His shirt was dark with it. "You're bleeding," she said, her nurse's voice returning. "It's fine." "No, it's not. Sit down." She unzipped his duffel bag and her hands found, to her relief, a comprehensive first aid kit. This was not his first time running. "I said I'm fine, nurse," he growled, but he sat heavily on an overturned crate. "And I'm ignoring you," she retorted, clicking on a battery-powered lantern from the kit, the room filled with a harsh, sterile light. "Take off your jacket and shirt." He hesitated, a flash of vulnerability crossing his features. Before he complied, the wound was worse than a graze. The bullet had torn a nasty, shallow trough along his ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly, but it was deep enough to be dangerous. She cleaned it with antiseptic wipes, her touch professional and impersonal. Though her heart was hammering, he was all hard muscle and scars, a roadmap of a life she couldn't imagine. He hissed as the alcohol bit into the raw flesh but didn't move. She threaded a surgical needle from the kit. "This is gonna hurt," she warned. "Get it over with." Her hands began to shake, the reality of it all, the church, the chase, this bunker. This man crashed down on her. The needle wavered. Before she could apologize, his hand, large and calloused, closed over hers, not hard, but firm, grounding. His skin was warm. He guided the needle to the edge of the wound. "I don't trust anyone else," he whispered. The words were a shock, and they steadied her. She looked from his hand, which was still covering hers, to his face. His gray eyes were locked on her, intense and unguarded. There was no one else in the world for him, and in that moment, there was no one else for her. She took a deep breath and began to stitch. Her movements became sure and practiced, a small, intimate act of mending in the midst of chaos. He never flinched, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the rigid control he held over his own pain. She was tying off the last stitch when he tensed for a different reason. He released her hand, his head snapping toward the door. Company. A second later, she heard it. Footsteps, heavy, measured, crunching on the gravel outside. Elias was on his feet, a gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. He pushed her behind the metal crate. "Stay down, don't move." The door burst open, and the bunker was filled with the blinding beams of 3 flashlights. "We know you're in here. Moretti?" a voice echoed. Elias didn't answer. He fired 3 times, fast. The flashlights shattered, plunging the room into a disorienting strobe effect as the gunmen returned fire. The noise was deafening. A physical assault, bullets ricocheted off the concrete, sending chips of stone flying. Marina cowered, her hands over her head, her body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. This was it. She was going to die here, in a hole, with a man she barely knew. One of the men was advancing, a dark shape against the door. Elias was pinned down. Exchanging fire with the other two, the man raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at Elias's exposed back. No! The word was a silent scream in her throat. She saw Elias's spare gun, the one that had fallen from his duffel bag. It was 2 feet away. She didn't think. She lunged, grabbing the cold, heavy metal. Her hands were clumsy. She'd never held a gun before, but she pointed it at the dark shape and pulled the trigger. The explosion was blinding. The recoil slammed her back against the wall, her arm feeling as if it had been hit with a bat. The man at the door grunted, a sound of surprise, and crumpled to the ground. Silence, heavy, ringing silence. Then, the sound of Elias finishing the other two. Quick, professional, final. Marina just stared at the man she had shot. She dropped the gun as if it were on fire. A sob tore from her chest, a raw, animal sound. She slid down the wall, her body racked with tremors. She had taken a life. Elias was at her side instantly. He grabbed her, pulling her into his chest, his arms like steel bands. He turned her head away from the body, pressing her face into his shoulder. "Shh, you're all right. Breathe. Marina, just breathe," he murmured, his voice a low, calming rumble in her ear. He held her tight as the sobs racked her body. He didn't let go until her breathing evened out. Then, he gently tilted her chin up. His eyes were soft, the gray storm in them stilled for a moment. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a kiss of absolution. "You're not weak," he whispered, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You just saved us." He helped her to her feet and grabbed a set of dark green paramedic jackets from his bag. They escaped through a ventilation shaft that led to a derelict garage. Inside was a decommissioned ambulance, old but clearly maintained. They drove, blending into the city's anonymous emergency traffic. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a hollowed-out exhaustion. The silence in the cab was thick. "She was part of the circle," Elias said suddenly, his eyes fixed on the road. "The one who betrayed me." Marina looked at him, confused. "I didn't just work with her," he clarified, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I loved her. I trusted her with everything, and she sold me to Cade, to the Ashen Circle, for power." Marina watched his profile, illuminated by the red and green lights of the dashboard. The cold, dangerous man from the church was gone. In his place was someone deeply wounded, a man hollowed out by betrayal and guilt. She saw the loneliness he carried, a burden heavier than any of his weapons. Her hand moved on its own, resting on his arm for just a second, a silent acknowledgement. He didn't pull away, and in the darkness, hurtling down a highway in a stolen ambulance, a fragile, dangerous thing began to grow between them. They drove north for 6 hours, ditching the ambulance in a long-term parking lot at a rest stop and stealing a nondescript, decade-old sedan. Elias navigated them off the main highways, onto winding back roads that seemed to lead nowhere. They ended up in Haverhill Ridge, a forgotten town in upstate New York that looked like it had been boarded up since the 1980s. Their destination was a small, derelict chapel on a hill overlooking the dead town. It was made of stone, and the roof had partially collapsed over the rectory. But the main sanctuary was intact, protected by a thick oak door that Elias opened with a key. "Another safe house?" Marina asked. Stepping inside, the air was cold and smelled of stone dust and dry leaves. "A place of last resort," he said, his voice echoing in the empty nave. The isolation was immediate and profound. There was no electricity, no running water, and the nearest sign of life was miles away. They were completely, utterly alone, trapped with only each other and the ghosts of their pasts. They subsisted on the canned goods and bottled water Elias had stashed in a hidden cellar. On the third night, The dam of silence broke. Marina was cleaning her brother's photo, the one from her apartment, the only personal item she'd managed to grab with the sleeve of her sweater. Elias was watching her from the shadows, where he always sat, oiling his gun. "Your brother." Marina nodded, her throat tightening. "Leo, he was 17. She turned the small frame over in her hands. "He was a good kid. Got mixed up with the wrong people. Just for a minute. He was trying to get out. He was standing on our front stoop, waiting for me to get home from my shift. They did a drive-by. She didn't look at him. She just stared at the cracked wood of the pew in front of her. The bullet that killed him was meant for someone else, but it doesn't matter, does it? He's just as dead." She finally looked up, her eyes hard and bright with unshed tears. "That's why I became a nurse, to save people. And it's why I hate what you are, what you do, what you made me do." The last part hung in the air, the weight of the man she'd shot in the bunker. Elias methodically reassembled his weapon, his hands never faltering, but his voice, when he spoke, was rough. "You think I like it?" He stood and walked to the altar, staring up at the bare, wooden cross. "You think you're looking at a good man, Marina a hero agent. That man died 5 years ago. He died the day he went inside." He turned to face her, his features carved by the moonlight slanting through the broken window. "To hunt monsters, I had to become one. I've done things that make what you did in that bunker look like a prayer. I'm not the man you should be trusting. I'm not the man you should be saving." "I don't think I'm saving you," she whispered. "Aren't you?" A storm was gathering outside, the wind howling around the stone corners, and the first drops of rain began to lash against the windows. Later that night, the storm was a deluge. The chapel was a cold, dark island in a sea of roaring sound. Marina was shivering, wrapped in a thin blanket. Elias lit a row of old votive candles on the altar, and the small, flickering lights gave the space a hollow, holy glow. He handed her a tin mug of water, their fingers brushed. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth in the suffocating cold. She didn't pull away. He didn't either. He stood close to her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from him. He was looking at the flickering candles, but his focus was somewhere else entirely. "If God isn't done with me," he said, his voice barely a murmur over the rain, "maybe he sent you to do it." She looked up at him, into those gray, broken eyes. "To do what finished the job." "No," he said, and his hand came up, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was rough, calloused, but incredibly tender. "To give me absolution." He was asking for something she didn't know how to give, but her body knew. Her soul, as bruised as his, recognized its counterpart. When he leaned in, she met him halfway. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and raw, a kiss of shared trauma and suffocating fear. His other hand fisted in her hair, not to be rough, but to hold on, to anchor himself. Her hands came up to grip his jacket, her knuckles white. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and rust and the metallic tang of his blood. He kissed her like he was trying to breathe her in, to steal the light and goodness she still had, and she kissed him back with the same ferocity, as if she could pour her own broken faith into him, stitch him back together just as she had stitched his side. It was a kiss of redemption and sin, a prayer and a curse, all tangled together in the candle-lit dark. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. Neither of them said a word. There was nothing left to say. The headlights cut through the rain. Elias was the first to see it, a sweep of bright light, cutting through the chapel's gloom for just a second. He was across the room before Marina even registered it, blowing out the candles, plunging them back into darkness. "What?" she whispered, her heart seizing. "Get in the cellar, now." "Elias, go." He shoved his gun into her hand, the one she had used before. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." But she didn't go. She stood, frozen, As the black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of the chapel's graveyard, its high beams cutting white lines through the storm, she must have blacked out from fear. The next thing she knew, she was waking up. She was on the cold floor, behind a pew, the gun still clutched in her hand. The chapel was silent. Save for the rain, the SUV was gone. She scrambled to her feet. "Elias!" The chapel was empty. His duffel bag was gone. His weapons were gone. A small electronic device on the window ledge was blinking a faint red, a silent alarm he must have set. She ran to the door and pushed it open. The storm had lessened to a drizzle. And she saw it. A single, dark drop on the stone step, and another, a small, dark trail of blood leading away from the chapel and into the field of leaning, ancient headstones in the graveyard. He hadn't run. He had gone out to meet them. Marina stared into the darkness, the cold rain on her face. The war hadn't come to them. He had taken it to the enemy. The real fight had just begun. She followed the blood trail, the gun heavy and cold in her hand. The rain had turned the graveyard mud into a slick, greedy soup that pulled at her boots. She found the first body half hidden behind a large, granite angel, a man in dark tactical gear, Elias's work. She found the second near the remains of the SUV, which had crashed into the stone retaining wall. The blood trail she was following, Elias's blood, continued past the wreck, toward the road. He was hurt, and he was outnumbered. "Looking for your shepherd, little lamb." The voice was smooth, cultured, and came from directly behind her. Marina spun, raising the gun with a trembling hand. A man stood there, flanked by two others. They were all wearing the long, dark robes of monks or priests, the hoods casting their faces in deep, religious shadow. The man in the center, the one who had spoken, was older. He had a kind face, silver hair, and the piercing, clear eyes of a true believer. He looked at the gun in her hand with something like pity, not fear. "That is not your weapon, child," he said gently. He stepped forward, and his two robed companions fanned out, their movements silent and practiced. They were not priests. She was surrounded. She had nowhere to run. She held the gun, but she couldn't pull the trigger, not on a man who looked like a bishop. "We are not here to harm you," the man said, his voice a soothing balm. "We are here to save you. You have fallen into the company of a very lost soul." He held out a hand. "Come with us. Come back to the light. My name is Cade." She was bundled into a black van, her hands bound not with cuffs, but with a velvet rope. They drove for hours in complete silence until they reached a city. She recognized the spires of Manhattan. They took her to a massive Gothic cathedral, a place of stunning, dark, opulent beauty. They didn't take her to the sanctuary. They took her down, into the stone catacombs beneath. The room was a cellar, but it was furnished like a high-end study. Ancient books lined the walls, and a single expensive-looking lamp cast a warm, golden glow. It smelled of old paper and beeswax. Cade sat across from her in a high-backed chair, steepling his fingers. "Elias was my son," he began, his voice filled with a terrible, paternal sadness. "Not by blood, of course, but by spirit. I found him, a brilliant, angry young man in the FBI, and I showed him the truth." "The Ashen Circle," Marina said, her voice dry. "We are a humanitarian fund, my dear," Cade corrected gently. "We do God's work in places the government has forgotten. Elias was my finest instrument. I gave him everything. I gave him power, purpose. I protected him." He leaned forward, his kind eyes hardening just a fraction, and then he became prideful. He saw the power I had built, the power God had entrusted to me, and he wanted it. He tried to dismantle my life's work from the inside. He betrayed me. "He said you betrayed him," Marina spat, finding her anger. Cade smiled, a thin, sad expression. The lies of a fallen angel are always the most convincing. He was compromised. "My dear, by a woman, of course. Always a woman." He sighed, as if truly burdened. "And now he has compromised you. Tell me where he is. Tell me what he has planned. Confess, child, and I will absolve you. I will let you go." "I don't know," she whispered. "That is a lie," Cade said. The kindness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp authority. "And we do not suffer liars in the house of God." The interrogation was not physical. It was worse. He used his words like scalpels, dissecting her faith, her fears, her memory of her brother. He spoke of her as a lost, sinful creature, clinging to a demon for salvation. He was cruel, relentless, and all in the name of God. He was about to ask another question when the ancient stone floor above them exploded, not with a bang, but a concussive, deafening boom that shook dust from the ceiling. A second explosion followed, and the sound of gunfire, heavy and automatic, echoed from the sanctuary. Cade's 2 robed guards rushed to the door, drawing weapons from beneath their vestments. Elias was already there. He came through the door like a wraith, a black-clad force of pure, focused violence. He was not the wounded man from the chapel. He was the monster he had warned her about. He dispatched the 2 guards with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Cade, for the first time, looked truly afraid. He grabbed Marina, pulling her up and pressing a small, sharp knife to her throat. "Stop, Elias, or she joins you in hell." Elias froze, his gun leveled at his former mentor. His face was a mask of cold fury, his gray eyes burning. "Let her go, Cade." "She's the only reason you are still breathing," Cade hissed. And Marina saw it. Elias's eyes flicked from Cade to her. He was calculating. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to end it. She saw the man he had become, the killer. But when his eyes met hers, she saw something else, too. He was not killing Cade. He was not killing for revenge. He was here for her. He fired. The shot was so fast, so precise, she didn't even see him move. It didn't hit Cade. It hit the large, ancient cross hanging on the wall behind him. The heavy iron cross, dislodged, swung down like a pendulum and slammed into Cade's side, sending him and Marina sprawling. Elias was on him in a second, but a deep, resonant bong echoed through the church bells. They were ringing, wildly, chaotically, a frantic alarm. "We have to go now," Elias yelled, pulling Marina to her feet. He didn't spare Cade a second glance. He shoved her toward a dark tapestry on the wall, ripping it aside to reveal a small, dark opening, a tunnel. "What about him?" she yelled. "He's not the one in charge," Elias shouted back, pushing her into the passage. Behind them, she saw the glow of fire. He had set charges. They ran through the dark, suffocating stone tunnel, the sound of the raging fire and the collapsing cathedral behind them. Smoke burned her lungs. They burst out into a side alley, collapsing against a brick wall, gasping for air. Elias was bleeding again, from his side, from a dozen new cuts. He looked at the burning church, the smoke and flames licking at the night sky like a vision of purgatory. He slumped against the wall, the adrenaline leaving him in a rush. "If you still believe in God," he gasped, his voice raw, "pray for me. Pray I get a chance to be a man again." He looked broken, defeated by the very monster he had unleashed to save her. She grabbed his face, her hands covered in soot, and forced him to look at her. "God doesn't abandon anyone, Ma," she said, her voice fierce, a defiant prayer, "including you." She kissed him. It was not the desperate, pained kiss from the chapel. This was a kiss of smoke and ash, a promise forged in fire. It was a vow. His hands came up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against him, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was burning to the ground. He kissed her back with a possessive, desperate hunger, a man starving for a life he thought he'd already lost. When they finally broke apart, they stared at each other for a second, their breaths mingling in the cold air. Then he grabbed her hand. "Run," he said. They disappeared into the night, leaving the cathedral to burn, a sacrifice to a war they were just beginning to understand. They ended up in Vermont, in a motel off a highway that hadn't been relevant since the 1970s. The sign just said motel in flickering red neon, and the man at the desk, who looked half asleep, didn't even blink when Elias, his face bruised and smeared with soot, signed the register as Mr. and Mrs. Walker. Their room was a box of beige and brown, smelling of stale smoke and pine-scented cleaner. This was their sanctuary. This was their fake peace. Elias was far more injured than she'd realized. The fire had left angry, weeping burns across his forearms, and in the chaos of the escape, his stitches had torn open. He collapsed onto the flimsy mattress not as a warrior, but as a man running on fumes. He had a fever by midnight. For 3 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of that room. Marina was a nurse again. This was a different kind of battlefield, one she understood. She cleaned his wounds with stolen antiseptic from a gas station, stitched his side closed again this time with dental floss and a sewing needle sterilized in a cup of bad whiskey. She bullied him into drinking water, forced him to eat the stale crackers and soup she bought from the vending machine. He was a terrible patient. He fought her. His body still wired for conflict, but his fever was too high. He was vulnerable, and he hated it. And in that vulnerability, the walls between them crumbled. She saw him not as the phantom, not as the killer, but as Elias. She saw the deep lines of pain etched around his mouth, the exhaustion in his bones. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke up, his eyes clear for the first time, and found her asleep in the hard-backed chair by his bed, her hand still resting on his forehead. The peace that followed was fragile, almost dreamlike. They were 2 people hiding from the world, playing house. She found a small hot plate in the room's kitchenette and tried to make real food. "I've never seen scrambled eggs look so resilient," Elias noted from the bed, his voice still rough. "Shut up and eat," she said, a smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The next morning, she woke to the smell of burning. Elias was standing at the hot plate, frowning at a smoking pan. "How do you make them not stick?" She came up beside him, her body brushing his. A jolt went through her, a simple domestic contact that felt more intimate than any of their desperate kisses. "You have to use oil, for starters," she said softly. She took the spatula from him, her hand closing over his. He didn't pull away. She showed him how to move the eggs, how to fold them. He was clumsy. His hands, so precise and deadly with a weapon, were lost in this simple task. They ate the slightly burned eggs in silence, a quiet, shared moment that felt dangerously normal. That afternoon, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, his burned forearms freshly bandaged. He'd been sifting through the contents of his duffel bag. "Close your eyes," he said. "This isn't a place for games, Elias. Just do it." She closed her eyes. She heard him move, and then felt the cold, delicate weight of a chain against her neck. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold air ran down her spine. "You can open them." She looked down. It was a necklace, a simple silver chain, but the pendant was a small, stylized symbol, a minimalist design she recognized from his ring, the logo for Redwater. "Elias, I can't—" "You're part of that world now, Marina," he said, his voice quiet. He was standing in front of her, and his fingers were at her neck, fastening the clasp. His touch was hesitant, gentle, his rough fingertips brushing her skin. I want you to have it, so I know who I'm fighting for." He's giving me his name, she thought, a cold wave of fear and a strange hot pulse of possession rising in her. That night, the peace shattered. Marina woke with a gasp. She wasn't in the motel. She was being held down, a hand at her throat, the cold, unmistakable circle of a gun barrel pressed to her temple. Her eyes flew open. It was Elias, but it wasn't. His eyes were wide, unseeing, and glazed with the sheer terror of a nightmare. He was breathing in harsh, sharp gasps. "Elias," she whispered, her voice shaking, but she forced it to be calm. "Elias, it's me. It's Marina." "She's dead," he hissed, the voice of a different man. "Cade, you're dead." "I'm not Cade," she said, her nurse's voice taking over. Her hand came up, very slowly, and covered his hand, the one holding the gun. "I'm right here. You're in Vermont. You're safe." "You are not there. You are with me." His fingers trembled, the pressure at her temple increased, and then, as if a string had been cut, it was gone. The gun clattered to the floor. He collapsed back against the headboard, pulling his knees to his chest, his head in his hands. A raw, ragged sound was torn from his throat. Marina didn't hesitate. She moved onto the bed, wrapped her arms around him from behind, holding him as he shook. She was not holding a killer. She was holding a man drowning in his own sins. She realized, in that cold, dark room, that their love was its own kind of battlefield. It wasn't about saving her life. It was about her fighting for his soul. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow. "Cade isn't dead." She froze. "You don't know that. You were dreaming." "I know it," he said, pulling away from her. He sat on the edge of the bed, his back to her, a silhouette of guilt. The fire, it wasn't enough. It was a distraction. I know how he thinks. He'll be in the shadows, rebuilding. He'll find us. He'll never stop. "So we keep running," Marina said, her voice desperate, clutching at the illusion. "We can go further. Canada." "No." He stood, his body a rigid line of resolve. "I've been running for 5 years, from him, from myself. I'm done running." He turned to her, his eyes the color of the storm again, but this time, it was a storm with a purpose. "I have to go back to New York. I have to end this. All of it." "You'll die," she cried, standing to face him. "Elias, you're not healed. He'll be waiting for you." "He'll be waiting for me to run," Elias said. "He won't be waiting for me to hunt him." He was determined. This was the end of the line, a final, brutal calculus. He had to end the loop of violence. She looked at him, at the man she had stitched together, the man who had given her his name, the man who had just held a gun to her head, and she knew she could not let him go alone. "All right," she said, her voice steady. He looked at her, surprised. "Marina, I'm not asking for your permission." She stepped forward, her hand coming up to touch the faint scar above his eyebrow, the one from the church. "If God isn't done with you," she said, echoing the words of Mrs. Agnes. "Maybe he's using me to finish it, Esther." Elias stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw her faith, her stubborn, broken, beautiful faith. A small, almost pained smile touched his lips. He leaned in and rested his forehead against hers, a moment of pure, agonizing stillness before the final battle. "Then you're my last miracle," he whispered. Returning to New York felt like walking back into the fire, but this time, Elias was the one holding the match. The Ashen Circle's power was not in the burned-out cathedral. It was here, in a sleek glass and steel monolith in Midtown, hiding behind the polished brass plaque of the Ashen Humanitarian Fund. They didn't sneak in through the shadows. They walked through the front door. Elias, with a chilling, latent skill Marina hadn't seen before, had created flawless press credentials. They were Mr. Walker and Miss Lowell, investigative journalists from a niche financial crimes publication, granted an appointment to discuss the fund's urban renewal projects. Marina's hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her nurse's scrubs replaced by a pencil skirt that made her feel like she was in costume. Her heart was a trapped bird against her ribs. Elias, however, was transformed. He was calm, his gray eyes hidden behind horn-rimmed glasses. He radiated a bored, intellectual authority. Their appointment was a ruse to get them inside, while Elias distracted a floor manager with probing. Technical questions about investment portfolios, Marina, using a keycard Elias had acquired, slipped away toward the basement. He joined her 30 seconds later. "The real brain of the operation is always in the basement," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as they descended in the service elevator. The archive room was cold, sterile, and silent, lined with rows of humming black servers. Elias plugged a small device into the main hub, his fingers flying across a tablet. "Cade's not just a gangster, he's a banker," he whispered, his eyes scanning the data. "He's not just taking over territory, he's taking over the market." The screen filled with code, which resolved into a series of financial ledgers. "He's planning a purge," Elias said, his voice hardening. "A massive, simultaneous transfer of assets. He's going to wipe out his rivals and any of his own people he can't trust by draining their accounts to zero. He's funding it with his own humanitarian money, making it all look legal. It's scheduled for tonight." "It's a bold play. You almost have to admire the scale." The voice was not Elias's. It was smooth, arrogant, and it came from the doorway behind them. Elias froze, his entire body going rigid. Marina turned. A man in an immaculate, $3,000 suit leaned against the door jamb. He was clean-cut, his smile easy, his eyes as dead and cold as a shark's. "Agent Vance," Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Ex-agent Moretti. Just like you," Vance said, his smile widening. He was the man Elias had mentioned, his former partner, the one who had set the original betrayal in motion. "Though, I seem to have landed on my feet, and you, well, you just keep falling, don't you?" Vance's cold eyes slid to Marina, dismissing her, assessing her, and insulting her all in one glance. "This is what you're reduced to, after everything, after her. You find a new conscience, you fell for a nurse." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You always were a sucker for a lost cause. Elias, Cade's going to be so disappointed you still haven't recovered." "Ooh, get out of the way, Vance," Elias said. He didn't turn around, his focus still on the downloading data. "I can't do that. Cade wants to see you. He's not picky about the condition. And he definitely wants the girl. She's the only one who saw the dot, after all." The data bar on Elias's tablet flashed green. Complete. Elias snapped the tablet shut, spun, and shoved Marina behind the largest server rack just as Vance's hand, holding a silenced pistol, came up. The first shot was a muffled thwack that sparked off the metal where Marina's head had been. Elias returned fire, his own weapon suddenly in his hand, the sound a deafening crack in the enclosed concrete space. The room erupted. 2 more guards poured in, their weapons unsilenced, and the basement became a war zone. Bullets ripped through expensive servers, sending a rain of sparks and shattered plastic. They were pinned, trapped between the gunfire and the back wall. "The stairwell," Elias yelled, reloading with a terrifying practice speed. "We can't make it," Marina screamed back. Vance was advancing, using the servers as cover. "It's over. Elias, just give up the girl." Marina saw it, on the wall, just to her right, a large, red, CO2 fire extinguisher. She didn't think. She grabbed it. It was heavier than she expected. "Elias, close your eyes," she shrieked. She pulled the pin, hoisted the canister, and stepped out from behind the rack. Squeezing the handle, a massive, choking cloud of white fog blasted into the room, instantly obscuring everything. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. Vance cursed, firing blind into the fog. "Go." Elias grabbed her hand, dragging her through the disorienting, freezing cloud. They burst through the stairwell door and took the steps 3 at a time, their feet hammering on the metal. "Where are we going?" Marina gasped. "Up the one place they can't box us in." They slammed through the final door and burst onto the rooftop. A violent, cold rain instantly slapped them, the wind howling. They were 40 stories up, surrounded by the glittering, indifferent lights of the New York skyline. The door behind them burst open. Vance. "There's nowhere to run." Moretti. They sprinted across the slick, wet tar toward a cluster of massive air conditioning units, a different sound, a sharp crack from a neighboring building, a sniper. Elias grunted, a short, sharp sound of impact, and stumbled. He didn't fall, he just stopped. "Elias," Marina whispered. He looked down at his chest, then back at her. "Run, Marina," he said. Before his legs buckled, he pitched forward onto the wet rooftop. "No!" she screamed. She slid to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his back. The shot was high on his right shoulder, but it was bad. Blood, dark in the rain, was already pooling. She grabbed him by the front of his jacket, her strength born of pure, primal adrenaline, and dragged him behind the cover of a huge metal air duct. His body was a dead weight. "Elias, stay with me!" She tore off her own soaked coat, balling it up, pressing it hard against the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath. It's not as bad as it looks," he gasped, his face pale and slick with rain. "Shut up, just shut up," she sobbed, applying pressure. The blood soaked through her coat almost immediately, hot and sticky against her cold hands. "Marina," he whispered, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. His touch was weak. "You have to go. The ladder, get to the street." "I am not leaving you," she cried, her tears lost in the downpour. You were my miracle," he breathed, his eyes starting to lose their focus. "No," she couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the end. He used his last bit of strength to pull her face down to his. His kiss was brutal, desperate, and final. It tasted of rain and metal and the salt of her tears. It wasn't a kiss of love. It was a kiss of goodbye. It was a man imprinting himself on her soul one last time before he let go. She tore her lips from his, her heart shattering. "No!" she screamed, hitting his good shoulder. "You don't get to die. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave me here. You're not done yet." A massive bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the rooftop in a stark, momentary daylight. And in that flash, she saw it. Glimmering on his chest, just inches from the bloody wound, steady and patient, was a small, perfect circle of red light, the laser. The sniper was waiting for a clean shot to the heart. The dot, it was the same red, the same perfect patient circle of death from St. Odelia's. It was hell come full circle. Marina's scream was a choked, soundless thing. She looked across the gulf of the street to the one dark building in the skyline, a beautiful, old stone church, its bell tower rising like a dark finger accusing the heavens, and in the arched opening, a silhouette. Cade. He had survived the fire, just as Elias had known. He was here, finishing the job, using a holy place to commit a murder. Elias was fading. His eyes were half closed, his breathing a shallow rattle. He was dying. And the red dot was moving from his bloody shoulder slowly, inexorably, toward his heart. No, the word was not a plea. It was a command. It was a denial of this reality, a rejection of this ending. Marina launched herself, a desperate, last-second lunge, throwing her body on top of his, a human shield. She covered his chest with her own. "You're not done yet," she screamed at him, at God, at the man in the tower. The world exploded in a sharp crack. A line of fire seared across her own shoulder, a white-hot pain that stole her breath and sent a spray of her own blood to mix with his on the wet tar. The bullet, meant for his heart, had grazed her, tearing through her jacket and her skin. It ricocheted with a ping off the metal ductwork behind them. The pain was blinding, but it was nothing compared to the shock that went through Elias. His eyes snapped open. He saw the new blood on her, the line of red that was not his own. He saw her face, contorted in agony and absolute, terrified defiance. She had taken a bullet for him. She had become his miracle. It was an absolution. It was a condemnation. It was rocket fuel for a dying fire. A guttural roar tore from his chest. It was not the sound of a man. It was the sound of a monster, of a protector. He shoved her off him, rolling her behind the cover of the ductwork. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a broken snarl. He rose to one knee. He was a dead man, but the dead were rising. He could feel the blood pumping out of his own wound, a heavy, wet warmth. He had one, maybe 2 seconds, before the sniper readjusted and fired again. He raised his gun, his arm shaking not from weakness, but from a profound, world-ending rage. He saw Cade in the tower. He saw the man who had made him, who had broken him, who was now trying to kill the only thing that had ever tried to save him. Cade was a shadow, too small, too far. A killing shot was impossible. But Elias wasn't aiming for Cade. His eyes, sharp and practiced, saw the thick, ancient chain just above Cade's head, holding a massive, iron sanctuary lamp, a heavy, ornate piece of forgotten devotion. He made his choice, not to be a killer, but to be an instrument. "God's not done," he whispered. He fired just once. The sound of his gun was lost in a clap of thunder. Across the street, the heavy chain shattered. The lamp, weighing hundreds of pounds, fell. It didn't make a sound from this distance. It just dropped. And the silhouette in the bell tower was gone. Elias's gun clattered to the rooftop. His strength, his rage, his very life left him all at once. He slumped, collapsing back onto the tar, his eyes rolling back. Elias Marina scrambled to him, ignoring her own burning shoulder. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands slick with a mixture of his blood, her blood and the rain. "Elias, stay with me. Don't you leave me, don't you dare." He was so pale. His lips were blue. She pressed her hand to his wound, the one in his chest, as if she could physically hold his life inside him. "I told you, son, God's not done with you yet." The voice, dry as old leaves, cut through the storm. Marina's head snapped up. "Mrs." Agnes was standing there, not 3 feet away. She was not wet from the rain. Her simple, dark dress was dry. Her gnarled hands were clasped in front of her, her old, clear eyes looking down at Elias with that same profound, strange pity from the church. "He's dying," Marina sobbed, her faith shattering. How did you—" "He's not yours to keep, child, Mrs.," Agnes said, her voice impossibly kind, "and he is not yet his to take." She looked at Marina, her gaze sharp. "Pray." Marina, a woman who had abandoned her faith, looked at the impossible woman, at the dying man in her lap, at the rain and blood, and she prayed. She bowed her head, pressed her hand to the red, bloody mess of his chest, and she prayed. She prayed to a God she hated, a God she had cursed, a God who had taken her brother. She prayed with a fury, a desperation that was more powerful than any rote Hail Mary. Elias's eyes flickered. He found her. His hand, weak and trembling, came up and grasped her wrist, the one pressed to his chest. His fingers were so cold. "If I live," he whispered, his voice a bare thread of sound, so quiet she almost missed it. "I'll live different." He was making a promise, a vow. The wail of sirens, distant but growing closer, cut through the night, not just police, but an ambulance. The red and white lights flashed in the street below, a pulsating, real-world miracle. "They're coming!" Marina wept, a wild, sharp relief stabbing through her. "Mrs." Agnes watched the flashing lights. She looked back at Elias, at Marina holding him. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Sometimes," she whispered to the wind, "salvation comes in the form of a lost soul." When Marina looked up again, she was gone. The rooftop was empty, save for her and Elias. Down below, the ambulance doors opened, the light spilling onto the wet pavement, in the alley, half hidden by a dumpster. A small, black-beaded rosary lay coiled in the gutter, the rain washing the blood from the silver cross. 6 months! The world can end and be reborn in 6 months. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of city pretzels and exhaust. But here, in this newly dedicated courtyard in Brooklyn, it mostly smelled like fresh paint and new soil. Elias Moretti stood at a podium, though he looked profoundly uncomfortable there. He wore a dark gray suit, but the formality was softened by the lack of a tie. He was no longer a phantom. He was a man, solid and real, addressing a small crowd. He was the founder of the Redwater Foundation, a name he had pulled from the ashes of his past and given a new, clean meaning. The foundation, funded by the anonymous liquidation of the Ashen Circle's assets, a parting gift from the FBI, who were all too happy to have their dead agent close the case, had just opened its first community health center. It was built on the same plot of land where St. Odelia's had stood before the sniper's nest, a new beginning from a place of sin. Marina Lowell stood just to the side of the stage. She wore simple blue scrubs, her hair tied back in a neat ponytail. She was the center's head nurse. Her gaze was fixed on Elias. He was speaking about second chances, about finding purpose in the wreckage. His voice was the same low gravel, but the hard edges had been worn smooth, not by violence, but by time. He finished his speech. The crowd applauded politely, and his eyes found hers. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between them, a language they had learned in tunnels and on rooftops. His gaze held the memory of that night, of the rain, the blood, and the feeling of life slipping away. Her gaze answered, "We're still here." Later, as the sun set, they were alone in the small, modern chapel built into the back of the center. It was nothing like the grand, dark cathedrals of their past. It was simple, made of light wood and clear glass, designed to let the city light in. It was a place for survivors. They stood in the aisle, the room lit only by a row of votive candles they had just lit. He'd been rubbing his chest through his shirt, a habit he couldn't break. "Is it bothering you?" she asked softly, her hand coming up to rest over his. "Always," he admitted. He unbuttoned the first two buttons of his shirt, pulling the collar aside. The scar was still vivid, a puckered, angry red mark over his heart, a permanent testament to the dot. "It reminds me that life can begin from death." Marina's fingers traced the edge of the scar, her touch feather light, a nurse's touch, a lover's touch. "And love," she whispered, her eyes meeting his, "can grow from blood and fear." He needed no other invitation. His hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. The motion was slow, deliberate, filled with a reverence that had been absent in their desperate, frantic kisses. This was not a taking. It was a question. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her answer clear. He kissed her. It was not the kiss of a dying man saying goodbye, nor the fire and ash promise of survival. This was the kiss of a man who had chosen to live. It was warm and solid and deeply, profoundly gentle. Her lips parted for him, a soft sigh of acceptance. His other arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her close, not with a desperate grip, but with a sure, steady possession. He was no longer a ghost. He was home. And she, in turn, was not his savior. She was his partner. The kiss was a quiet vow, a seal on their new life, a blessing they gave themselves under the watch of 100 tiny flames. When they parted, they just held each other, their breathing in sync, their foreheads resting together. And then, the sound, a clear, single bell, the new chapel bell ringing for the evening service. It was the same note, the same rhythm as the one that had tolled on that first, damp Sunday morning. A shuffling sound from the pews made them turn. Mrs. Agnes sat in the back row, a small, dark shape in the candlelight. She was smiling, a genuine, warm expression that crinkled her entire face. She looked at them, at the scar, at their joined hands, and she slowly, reverently, made the sign of the cross. "Now," she said, her voice clear and satisfied in the small space, "God is done." Elias smiled, a slow, real smile that reached his eyes, a sight that still made Marina's heart ache. He kept his arm around Marina's waist, turning her to face the altar, to face their future. His gray eyes, no longer stormy, but clear and deep, found hers. They were tender, but they held the same fierce intensity she had fallen in love with. "No," he whispered, "just for her. He's just getting started." 1 year later, the bells of a different church, a grand old cathedral in the heart of Manhattan, tolled a slow, solemn rhythm for the dead. It was a city-wide memorial service for the victims of the Ashen Circle, a public reckoning with the shadows that had been allowed to fester for so long. The fund was a dissolved entity. Its leadership, those who had survived Cade's fall and Elias's data dump, were serving life sentences. Elias and Marina sat not in the back, not in the shadows, but in the second row. They were not hiding. They were bearing witness. Elias wore a simple black suit, his posture relaxed, his hands resting in his lap, not near a weapon. Marina was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The scar on her own shoulder, a thin white line, was a secret she kept under her blouse, a matching mark to the one on his chest. They listened to the names being read, to the speeches from politicians who had, a year ago, been taking the Circle's money. They listened to the prayers for the lost, for the families, for the city. When it was over, they filed out with the other mourners, stepping from the incense-laden darkness of the cathedral into the blinding, brilliant afternoon sun. The light was almost a physical force, a shock after the dim, somber service. They paused on the top step, a silent, shared habit, their eyes scanning the crowd, a vestige of a life that was no longer theirs but had left its mark. The street was full of news vans, of families crying, of people just getting on with their day. It was in that moment, as Elias turned his head to look at her, that it happened. A flash, a small, perfect circle of piercing red light, landing directly on his chest, right over the scar, right over his heart. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even tense. He just stopped. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in a strange, profound recognition. Marina's breath caught in her throat. Her hand, which had been on his arm, flew to her mouth, her heart stopping, the entire world narrowing to that single, terrifying dot. The past, the rooftops, the rain, the blood, it all came crashing back in a single, cold second. But the shot never came. Elias looked down at his chest. Then he looked up. He wasn't looking for a sniper's nest. He was looking at the source. High above them, the massive, ornate rose window of the cathedral was catching the afternoon sun. A single pane of deep, ruby-red glass depicting the Sacred Heart was gathering the light and focusing it, like a celestial lens, onto the man standing on the steps below. It was not a warning. It was a benediction. A sound bubbled up in Marina's chest, a sound that had been absent for so much of her life with him. It was a laugh. It was a genuine, startled, joyful laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. She dropped her hand from her mouth and pressed it, warm and firm, directly over the red light on his chest, covering his scar with her palm. He looked at her, and the confusion on his face melted away as he saw the laughter in her eyes. God, she said, her voice shaking with amusement, is still not done with you. The old words, once a prophecy of dread, were now a shared joke, a promise of a future. Elias stared at her for a moment, at this woman who had dragged him back from the dead, who had taught him how to live again. A slow smile, the one that was still reserved just for her, spread across his face, lighting his gray eyes from within. He laughed, a low, warm sound that made the people on the steps near them turn. He covered her hand with his, pressing her palm more firmly against his heart, trapping the red light between them. "And then he'd better keep up," Elias said. He kept her hand in his, lacing his fingers through hers, and together, they turned away from the church, away from the shadows, and walked down the steps, into the blinding, ordinary, beautiful sunlight. As they disappeared into the New York crowd, the light of the sun continued to stream through that one pane of ruby glass, painting the cathedral's stone floor a brilliant, holy red. A soft, clear recording of Ave Maria could be heard from the closing doors of the church, a thread of sound that wove itself into the fabric of the city. Between sin and forgiveness, Between darkness and faith, love remained the one miracle that even God dared not prevent. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please comment below and share your thoughts with us. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our channel, Mafia Boss Story, and give this video a like. You can also show extra support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.